Thank you, and thank you to the faculty for inviting me. I'm a home treatment consultant, I'm not a forensic consultant. I'm always interested to see what it is forensic psychiatrists actually do. I have a few different roles. One of my roles is I'm part of what's called the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. So we're a specialist group that advises the Home Office on drug harms. So we were the group a while ago that made a recommendation to the Home Secretary about the rescheduling of cannabis for medicinal use, which you may have mixed feelings on. But it introduces one key first message from me to you. Most people who take drugs are not particularly harmed by them. And I think lots of people struggle with that message. I went for dinner last night with some psychiatrists, some forensic psychiatrists who talk about early life experience with drugs. And I think they've done okay. So most people who take drugs are not particularly harmed. Some people are, and the harms can vary from people losing their life to loss of opportunity. And then the third part is, some drugs have medicinal use. We think about LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, lots of interest. Those three things are true at the same time. Some people are not harmed, some people are harmed, and some people, they may have medicinal value. And what I'm going to talk about is a newer group. So when I went to medical school, we only had about 6 drugs. And now you have over 600. And I've got 20 minutes to tell you about them. But I want to cover a couple of key points. I think we can do it in 20 minutes. I'm optimistic about it. I'm going to talk how we got here. I want you to come out of here with a few key messages. One is saying legal highs or saying NPS is a useless phrase. You're not going to say it after today. It's like saying somebody takes drugs. That's insufficient information, so you're not going to do it anymore. The second thing is, should they synthesize 6,000 new drugs, we're going to be okay because we're going to describe a format to categorize. There are only 4 groups, and I'm going to try to convince you, you already know them. You just don't know you know them, and I'll tell you you know them. And then we'll finish with some pragmatic stuff about what do we do next. If you're interested in a bit more detail, some of this comes from a couple of BMJ papers we did last year. So there's a synthesis of NPS, novel psychoactive substances. Now you don't need to be a statistician, that's going up. Over 100 new drugs being synthesized per year. A colleague of mine in the ACMD who uses what's called web crawler technology thinks we're out by an order of magnitude. He suspects it's 10 times bigger than that. We have identified 100 new drugs per year. And this introduces the issue where you think, I'm not a substance misuse guy, I couldn't keep up with the 6 of them, no way I can keep up with that. And what was happening, let me go back slightly, what was happening with drugs was a chemist would get a drug, say ecstasy, MDMA, and they would biochemically change it. So they'd add on a carboxyl group, and they would say, this isn't ecstasy, I've changed it. Ecstasy is illegal, this is legal, and they would sell it. And after a while, the government would say, it's pretty much like ecstasy, and they would ban it. And then they would get that drug, and they'd add on a nitrogen molecule. And they would say, this is neither ecstasy nor the recently banned compound, this is a novel psychoactive substance. And they would sell it. And the government would catch up after a while and ban it. And we had this explosion. And after a while, the government said, I think I see what you're doing there. And they banned them all. And we'll come on to that. But there's a bit of moral panic with it. And just there's some data on drug use more generally. Take the top left one, cannabis, Britain's favourite drug. And if you have a look at it, about a quarter of adults would say they've used cannabis in their life, maybe 15% in the last year. Down at the bottom right are NPS. Maybe 8% have ever used. It's always hard to get good data on drug use. 3% in the last year. Not everyone is doing it. There is a bit of panic. However, NPS have a few criteria that make them popular to some people. They're really difficult to detect, and they're very cheap. Do you know people who don't have much money and really don't want to get caught using drugs? Yeah, they're your patients. But also again to remind us, actually drug use is going down. So when I was in university, the prevalence of drug use is about twice what it is now. Kids are cleaner these days. And if we divide the world rather binary into people who use drugs and people who don't use drugs, which is a bit artificial, most people who use drugs do it once or twice a year. Again, it's not a big thing for lots of people. So most people who consume drugs don't have a particular problem. Some people do. It depends on the drug, depends on how you use it, and it depends on the person. But there has been panic, so you get all this stuff. So if I say spice to you, as forensic psychiatrists, I'm sure you've heard that before. So this is what the government did. I'm not going to try to score political points. This was against the advice of the ACMD. The ACMD did not recommend this. In fact, they suggested it might not be effective. Some of you will be in favour of the prohibition of drugs. I would challenge you, you've got till the end of the day, to find me a society in the entirety of human history where a drug was banned and people said, okay, let's stop doing it. It's not particularly effective. But this came in to ban it, and it did so it shifted the drug market. So now the head shops are closed. So you can't go into a head shop, a street shop, and buy drugs. And people thought, that's fairly good. So now if my son wants to buy drugs, which I hope he doesn't, he can't go into a head shop. He's got to go into a field to meet a guy on a BMX bike with a knife in his jacket. So that's what it's done. This law has banned everything prospectively. So as soon as a new drug is made, it's presumed banned unless it's exempted. And that would apply to anything that's psychotropic. So a new antidepressant is presumed banned unless it's exempted. What about that? Is that legal, illegal? You see that everywhere? Walk outside your hospital, it's all over the place. Nitrous oxide? Illegal? Amazon selling it? There's no way a multinational would break the law just to make money. Now, if you have a look at the top, it says Derek's Amazon, it was research for today. So Amazon are selling it. Why can you buy nitrous oxide on Amazon? Whipped cream. I mean, take your point, Chris, I can do more dangerous things with whipped cream than I can with novel psychoactive substances. But this introduces a second issue about changing drug laws. There's a counter-argument to liberalise and decriminalise everything. This is what will happen. That's really expensive. If you want to take nitrous oxide, that's a stupid way to buy it, because it's taxed and you've got to pay postage. So you can change drug markets, but it doesn't mean people stop where they necessarily buy. You will all buy organically grown cannabis. Lots of people don't have the money and they'll say, give me what I can have for this amount of money. So again, if you know people without much money who don't get caught, that group of people will never buy from Amazon. Now, this is the key part of my talk, the next slide. I want to do a thought experiment with you. And my thought experiment is, I have 4 friends outside, I'm going to bring them in, I'm going to introduce you to them, and you're going to take a history from them. So just hypothetical. I don't actually have 4 friends, but we're going to talk through it. My first friend takes ecstasy most weekends, depends. It's often not planned. When he goes to a nightclub, he drinks a bit of alcohol, takes some ecstasy. I'm going to bring him in a minute to talk to you. I think it's having an impact. He crashes out a bit Monday, Tuesday. I think it's part of his psychological well-being. I think it's caught up in a bit of a picture of unhappiness, and I want you to meet him. My second friend smokes cannabis every day, heavy use. I'm really quite worried about him. It's definitely impacting his mental state. He's really getting paranoid. I'm going to bring him in and talk to you. Now, you have 2 different models. My friend who's using ecstasy intermittently, and my friend who's using cannabis. They're stereotypes, they're generalizations, but they're helpful, and hang on to them. There's more information you want. My third friend injects heroin every day. He's going to stumble in here because he needs a crutch to walk because he lost part of his leg, and I want you to get information from him. And my fourth friend, if he's still hanging around, uses LSD, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. I want you to talk to him. Now, you've got 4 different models. They are the NPS. That is your working model. We have NPS stimulants. These are novel drugs like ecstasy. We have NPS cannabinoids, new drugs like cannabis. We have NPS depressants, drugs like heroin. And we have NPS hallucinogens, or psychedelics, drugs like LSD. Now, if you know the field, I'm only covering about 95% of them, but if I can, get 95% of 600 drugs in 20 minutes, I'm happy with that. So you will find exceptions. And now you're not going to say NPS anymore, you're going to say my patient takes NPS stimulants, because that's really important. That's very different to taking NPS cannabinoids. If I tell you your patient takes ecstasy or your patient takes cannabis, you're interested in the difference. Because we have different working models of harms, we have different working models of treatment, and that's what you need to take from this. Now, the NPS do introduce some differences. The differences are, in each of those categories, we now have several hundred drugs. So I'm going to talk briefly about NPS stimulants. There's about 200 of them, and they range from ecstasy-like to amphetamine-like to cocaine-like, but there's a lot of them. So it's a bigger range, but they're in that pool. The synthetic cannabinoids, again, we've got about 200. It's a range, but we'll think about it. The second thing you've got to know now, All bets are off when it comes to how they are consumed. If I say ecstasy, you're thinking tablet. If I say cocaine, you're thinking snorting. If I say heroin, you're thinking injecting or smoking. Now you can no longer presume. There's an increase in the incidence of HIV at the moment in the UK, and it's partly due to people injecting novel stimulants. It's a group of people who don't traditionally inject drugs, and their drug injecting technique is PERM. So you need to say, how do you take this drug? You can't presume. The synthetic cannabinoids you can drop in your eye. I mean, you can put it on paper, you can eat it, there's anything you can do. You need to ask. So I'm going to focus primarily on the stimulants and the cannabinoids because we don't have much time. If you want, you can invite me back next year if your conference is somewhere good. The stimulants, they vary from, our traditional drugs are amphetamine, cocaine, ecstasy, and they act on serotonin, noradrenaline. More dopaminergic are more addictive, you get a more mania-like picture. More serotonergic stimulants are what are called entactogenic. That means feeling loved up. That's why people like them. The classic drug there is ecstasy. And it's the ratio of serotonin to dopamine that's important with these drugs. That's just an example there. You can see some novel stimulants. I don't know if you can read it on the bottom. The bottom one there, butylone. It's not particularly dopaminergic. It's quite strongly serotonergic. That synthetic would be quite like ecstasy. Quite like ecstasy. If you look at the cathinones, about halfway up, they're quite strongly dopaminergic, not so strongly serotonergic. They'll be quite like amphetamines. But the point here is we've got a range of them, about 200, and they go from ecstasy-like to amphetamine-like. So they are different. The main risks: impulsivity, risky behaviour, doing stupid things when you take drugs. The names often end in -one, so methadone, bufenadrone, it often looks like that. And again, you can take that in a whole wide range of ways. You can snort it, you can swallow it, you can inject it. Our second group, which is the other one we need to think a lot about, are the synthetic cannabinoids. People often call them SCRAs, synthetic cannabis receptor agonists. Don't say Spice. Spice just one that came out a while ago. It's a bit like Hoover, it's a brand name. And we have an endocannabinoid system in our brain. It's to do with neuronal homeostasis and so forth. THC kicks that off, so cannabis kicks that, people feel stoned. It's a partial agonist. Now, our synthetics are different in a few really important ways. They are nothing to do with the plant. They're synthesized in a lab. They do not come from the cannabis plant. They're crystals, they can be dissolved. You can take them in a whole wide range of ways. Really hard to detect. You know, urinary drug tests are typically about 2 years out of date. If someone runs in with the latest one now, it will detect drugs up to about 2 years ago, and they're being synthesized at the rate of 100 a year. So not particularly good in clinical practice. I was like, you know how they make urinary drug tests? What they do is they get the new drug, they inject it into sheep, the sheep develop antibodies, and then they get it onto a reaction strip. I just like the idea of some field in Wales with lots of sheep just looking at the sun, asking where Dave is. If I was a sheep, that would be the life for me, let me tell you. The synthetics, as well as being entirely made in a laboratory, they are full agonists at the receptor. THC is a partial agonist. They're full agonists. They are typically much more potent. Now, we have about 200 of them. Some are milder, some are very strong. So you've seen this AK-47 one, the zombie one, with people lying on benches. Some of them are really potent. And you will have seen this. They're producing a different clinical picture where people are agitated, aggressive. So sometimes, I do have forensic friends. Some of my best friends are psychiatrists or forensic. And they will call me and say, this guy is tearing to pick you apart. He went out for a leave and he's come back and he's off his face. That's probably a synthetic cannabinoid. You can have a hangover state with it. Doesn't smell like cannabis. It's hard to detect. And our problems here are obvious. So cannabis has always been the drug we love to hate. So cannabis is the one for us in terms of psychosis, paranoia, and altered mental state. The synthetics can do the same. They seem more potent. They produce a more acute potent state, typically in people. Two anxieties for me with the ACMD work. One is a speculative thing. There's a generation of children, and they now have the opportunity to have synthetics as their first cannabis-like drug. If this drug is neurodevelopmentally damaging, and evidence suggests it is, I worry that we're going to see a cohort of people coming through with a different looking psychosis within the next 5 to 10 years. Now that's speculative, it's hard to know. Most kids stay away from it, but again, people who don't have much money, this stuff is cheap. And it looks like that if you're interested. They look like kind of posh tea bag packets. Nobody is stupid enough to bring them into your hospital in the packet. I like the middle one. I'm just curious about who sees that packet and thinks, I know what my brain needs. A nuclear explosion. I'll have 2 packets, please. On the right, that's how it's typically consumed, because within cannabis culture, smoking is more common, but that's just spread onto a smoking mix. I mean, you can take it in lots of forms, but it's typically smoked like a joint. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mention the depressants really quickly, and I'm going to mention the hallucinogens really quickly. We don't have much time. You're not going to see these at the moment. 2 classes, benzo-like NPS. We know benzos. There aren't that many benzo NPS. They seem to have perfected it with diazepam and lorazepam, but they would be like those drugs. Worryingly, some of the NPS benzos have really long half-life, which gives us 2 properties. One is it means it's harder to get addicted. The second is people think they're not working, so they take them. They think nothing's happening, I'll take another one, and they're coming up really slow, and people are accidentally overdosing. But there aren't too many at the moment. The other class, the opioids, they're not here yet. This is the second thing within the ACMD work that really worries me. This is ravaging America at the moment. The novel carfentanyls are up to 10,000 times more potent than heroin. 10,000 times more potent. I don't know if you've ever done it. You've got to be fairly careful when you inject heroin. This is 10,000 times more potent. Now, it's not in the UK that much. Some drugs are local, so PCP, phencyclidine or angel dust, never really came across, it was a North American thing. Will the novel opioids come to the UK? It's not clear. Some of them have come, it's not a big thing. You will know, because there will be a lot of people dying very quickly. And you won't have to ask, are they here? It's not very good for drug dealers, actually. They do prefer you to have a life of misery rather than for you to drop dead. And one of the other anxieties with this is some drugs are being laced with the novel depressants. The other class, very quickly, because we've got time here, are hallucinogens. We have dissociatives and psychedelics. So dissociatives are novels that are like ketamine or PCP. You probably won't see them that much because you don't see that much ketamine or PCP anyway. If you work in A&E, you'll see them because they're getting dropped in at the weekend having cardiac arrests. And psychedelics, again, it's an urban myth. You don't see people with LSD problems. You might do, there's always someone who says I have. They are an issue. You're probably going to see them less. So, what are we going to do? My key point again. Thank you. 4 big categories. We have NPS stimulants, drugs that are like amphetamines, cocaine, ecstasy. We have NPS cannabinoids, drugs that are like cannabis. We have NPS depressants, drugs like benzos and opioids. And we have NPS hallucinogens, psychedelics, and dissociatives. You need to get the category, and you're going to treat it based on that category, but you're going to ask, how do you take it? It's a big deal if I inject it rather than snort it. It's self-evident to us. There's David Nutt's favourite graph. You've seen this lots of times from the Lancet. On the x-axis is how harmful is a drug to me if I consume it. On the y-axis, how harmful is a drug to everybody else. And there is the world's most dangerous drug by far, alcohol. That's what's known as a statistical outlier. That's almost on the previous slide. Now, if alcohol was invented today, it would be immediately banned as a scourge of Britain. And it'd be easy to ban it because it's very hard to carry around cases of cans and sell them when it's banned. But we choose to allow some drugs and we choose to ban others. There's tobacco, just to make some of you feel bad. And there are all the types of drugs harms you can have. We think again about the sharp edge of the wedge, people dying, mortality, but of course, so things like impacting relationships, employment, and so forth. I think our issue is we need to hold some uncomfortable truths at the same time. Why do people take drugs? They take them because they're fun. And you're going to have to live with that fact. And people will continue to take drugs as long as there are people. It's in our nature. Most people don't take drugs. You can't be this person. So my son will say, that's a mean dad. It's not real. But you don't want to be the big hand saying, you know, if you take drugs, you're going to go to hell. Conversely, that's a real ad. It's from the 70s. But, you know, if you legalise drugs, what message do you give out? And I think we have to hold these uncomfortable truths. How do you not be the big hand? And how do you have liberal conversations? When will you see them? What will you do? You're going to see them. You see them now already, and you're going to see more of them. So people might just say, this part of history, is it important? Maybe, it depends on the person. It might not be. It might be part of a substance use profile. It might be acute and tox, but that's more on A&E. And there's a perpetuating factor with mental health problems. At the moment, consider the risks based on the parent class. So is it cannabis-like, is it stimulant-like, is it opioid-like? So this is your problem. What I would suggest, if you've got someone with NPS, this is the information you want. This is basic history. My problem is people tend to say they take NPS. This is what you want to get. Can you give me the major class? It's really important for me to know if they're on cannabinoids versus opioids. That's a big deal. Now, people don't always know what they're taking, they won't always tell you what they're taking, and they're not always accurate with what they're taking. You can only do your reasonable best. Try get the category. How do you take it? It's really important to know, do you snort it? Do you inject it? Do you swallow it? What's the consumption pattern? How often do you take it? Twice a year? Well, maybe it's not a big problem for you. And what types of harms? Is it harming your physical health, your mental health? Are there vulnerable people around you? Are there children there? Are you being exploited? I'm not a substance misuse guy, but the Frames model to me is not being the big hand, is saying, well, look, I'm here to help. Where do you want to get to in your life? Are drugs in the way? What shall we do together? Particularly if there are junior doctors here, a few quick things. Acute intoxication, if they come back to your unit, don't panic. In the same way you don't panic when people come back and they smoke a joint. Sit them down, give them a cup of tea if they're not too aggressive, and just see how they're doing. Take basic obs, watch them. If they start to lose consciousness, if their blood pressure drops, yeah, blue light them. But don't panic, you don't have to panic with this stuff. Serotonin syndrome is a possibility with the stimulants, but not with the cannabinoids, because cannabinoids have nothing to do with serotonin. So it's a stimulant-like drug, especially if they're on antidepressants, and you treat it as you would ordinarily treat serotonin syndrome. Importantly for you, there are limited data on the topic, but the data that do exist, and you can quote me on this, say antipsychotics are appropriate to give where someone is psychotic. Now, I think you would do that anyway, but if you are worried about it, treat the patients. But the best evidence at the moment says, yes, give an antipsychotic with NPS-induced psychosis. The problem is some of the acute stuff looks harder to treat, and you may have had experiences. I mean, some people are coming in with really early stage negative symptoms or aggression that's not coming down on standard doses. That's a problem, but you still go through a usual treatment regime. Urinary drug tests, they're not much use. I would still recommend you do them because it's grip. In the same way, you don't let people walk into the ward with a bottle of vodka. It's a message, so I would say, yes, do the tests. And on that, I'll leave a slightly political note to say, thank you.